In this video, we uncover the chilling story of Jane Andrews, a woman who once lived in the glow of royalty, but whose life spiraled into betrayal, obsession, and murder. What could drive a woman who worked alongside the Duchess of York to commit such a shocking crime? Let's dive into Jane's journey, from a troubled childhood filled with hardship to the shocking tragedy that would leave everyone in disbelief. Jane Andrews was born on April 1, 1967, in Cleethorpes, England, to a family that struggled to make ends meet. Her father, a joiner, couldn't hold down a steady job, bouncing between part-time work, never able to provide the stability his family needed. Her mother, a social worker and later an assistant teacher, worked tirelessly to support them, but even with her steady income, they often couldn't afford the basics. They lived in a small house with no bathroom, just an outside toilet, and Jane remembers searching for spare change to buy a loaf of bread. But no one ever knew just how bad it was. Her family put on a brave face, pretending everything was fine. It was the pride of survival that held them together, yet the scars ran deep, especially for Jane, who began to feel the weight of her circumstances at a young age. As a child, Jane was smart, talented, and her teachers saw her potential. But as she entered her teenage years, things began to shift. Depression and anxiety crept in, making her feel alone, trapped in a world she couldn't escape. Her grades slipped, and she became withdrawn, unable to talk about the storm brewing inside her. By 17, Jane's pain became unbearable. She tried to take her own life, swallowing a handful of pills, but by some twist of fate, she survived. She woke up, but the sadness lingered, and the sense of hopelessness followed her into adulthood. Instead of finding comfort in lasting relationships, Jane's life became a series of fleeting moments. She had a child at 17 with a man who wasn't ready for the responsibility. Feeling overwhelmed and unsure, she made the difficult decision to end the pregnancy. Even though it was the choice she thought was best, it haunted her. It was a decision she'd carry for years, never fully able to move past the loss. As she tried to find a way forward, Jane sought solace in fashion. She enrolled in a fashion design program, landing a job designing clothes for a British store chain. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. But Jane hated the small life in Grimsby. She knew she wasn't meant for it. Her mind constantly wandered to something bigger, something better. She spent hours looking through fashion magazines, picturing herself in the luxury and glamour that filled the pages. She didn't just want success, she needed it. It wasn't enough to simply get by. She wanted to escape, to step into a life of wealth, beauty, and power. In 1988, Jane saw an ad for a job as a dresser. A woman was looking for someone to help with her clothes, and Jane, not realizing how close this job would bring her to royalty, decided to apply. Within months, she was on her way to meet Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York. Sarah, known as Fergie, was the wife of Prince Andrew, a woman whose life was nothing like Jane's. But when the two women met, something clicked. They got along immediately, and within a week, Jane had the job. Just like that, her life was about to change forever. From the small town of Grimsby to the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, Jane's world was opening up. For the first time, she felt like she was on the path she'd always dreamed of. Her first paycheck was a modest £17,000 a year, but that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the access. Access to the royal world, to wealth, to connections she never thought possible. Jane traveled the world with Sarah, met powerful people, and began transforming herself into the person she thought she should be. She took voice lessons to lose her northern accent, changed the way she dressed, and adapted her entire demeanor to fit in. For Jane, this was more than a job. It was an opportunity to reinvent herself and escape her past. But as Jane became more ingrained in this new world, she realized that it wasn't enough to simply work for the rich and famous. She wanted to be one of them. She dreamed of marrying a wealthy man, someone who could give her the life she had always wanted. In 1989, Jane met Christopher, a man 21 years older than her, who was successful and well-mannered. Everything Jane had been looking for. But Christopher was already in a relationship. Jane wasn't deterred. She pushed him to choose her, and he did. They were engaged within a year, and soon they were married. But what started as a fairy tale quickly soured. The passion wasn't there. Jane and Christopher became more like friends than lovers, and after a series of affairs, their marriage ended in 1994. Jane wasn't devastated, she had already moved on. She found someone else, Dimitri Horn, a wealthy Greek shipping magnate. Dimitri was charming, successful, and Jane was soon swept up in a whirlwind romance. But the demons of jealousy that Jane had battled for so long came crashing back. She couldn't stand seeing Dmitri talk to other women. Her possessiveness took over, and when Dmitri broke up with her, Jane's anger exploded. She trashed his apartment, cutting up his clothes and destroying his things. In a moment of desperation, she overdosed on pills. Again, she survived. But Jane was no longer the woman she had been. Her life, filled with riches and promises of happiness, was unraveling in ways she couldn't control. What came next would change everything, and set her on a path toward the darkest moment of her life. After the dramatic fallout from her breakup with Dmitri, Jane found herself at another crossroads. With her life slipping through her fingers and the remnants of her relationships falling apart, she had no choice but to push forward, this time with a renewed sense of desperation. In 1997, after 9 years of working for the Duchess of York, Jane was fired. Officially, the reason was budget cuts. Sarah Ferguson's divorce from Prince Andrew had led to financial strain, and as a result, she could no longer afford to pay her staff the same way. But there were whispers. Some speculated that Sarah, now romantically involved with an Italian businessman, had noticed the way Jane looked at her new partner. Fearful that Jane might try to steal him away, Sarah decided to let her go. The truth was, Jane had invested everything into this royal lifestyle, and now it was all crashing down. Fired from a position she had worked so hard to attain, Jane was left reeling. She couldn't return to Grimsby. London was where she needed to stay. She found a new job managing the look of a hotel, but after just 2 months, she was let go. It was clear that Jane lacked the experience for such a role, and the reality of her situation began to hit her hard. Jane was now searching for her next move. She took a job at a jewelry store, not because of the paycheck, but because of the potential connections. She wanted to be around the powerful people she had come to crave. But as she made these new connections, she found herself facing another turning point, one that would set the stage for the shocking events that would follow. In 1998, Jane's path crossed with Thomas Ashley Cresman. He was 31 years old, tall, good-looking, and from a wealthy family. Everything Jane had been searching for. His father was a self-made billionaire, with a number of car dealerships spread across Europe. Thomas was the kind of man Jane had dreamed of, successful, charming, and most importantly, the escape she had longed for. They met through mutual friends, and almost instantly, Jane was smitten. She saw in Thomas everything she needed: stability, wealth, and a life beyond her wildest dreams. He called her daily, even while she was in Greece with friends, greeting her with bouquets of roses. The relationship seemed perfect on the surface. Jane moved into his house within 3 months, and for a brief moment, she felt like she had finally found the life she had always desired. But even this perfect romance began to show signs of trouble. The demons of jealousy returned with a vengeance. Jane couldn't stand it when Thomas spoke to other women, and her need for control over every situation became suffocating. She watched his every move, and when she discovered an email from another woman, a message sent while Thomas was in the US, she was consumed with suspicion and anger. She was sure he was cheating. The confrontation was inevitable. Jane confronted Thomas, demanding the truth. Thomas tried to calm her down, explaining that the email meant nothing, that he had only met the woman once, and that it was nothing more than a casual exchange. But Jane couldn't believe him. The jealousy and obsession that had tormented her for years now consumed her completely. The tension between them reached a boiling point during a trip to the French Riviera. It was meant to be a romantic getaway, their second anniversary. Jane had hoped that Thomas would finally propose, that this trip would be the moment she had been waiting for. But as the days passed, no proposal came. Jane began to feel the coldness between them growing, and her frustration boiled over. On the last day of their trip, Jane finally confronted him. She asked point-blank why he hadn't proposed. Thomas, however, delivered a crushing blow. It wasn't going to happen. Not now. Not ever. His words shattered Jane. The world she had built in her mind, of love, wealth, and security, crumbled instantly. The anger, hurt, and betrayal she felt in that moment were too much to handle. She was devastated. The fight between them grew intense. Jane's emotions spiraled out of control. She couldn't fathom the idea of losing him, but Thomas's cold rejection left her feeling powerless and abandoned. The rest of the trip was filled with bitterness and tension, their fights echoing through every moment. Jane's world had fallen apart, and she couldn't pick up the pieces. 2 days later, back in London, Thomas was found dead. He had been stabbed, his body lying motionless on the floor. The crime scene was puzzling. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows. The only indication that something was wrong was the bloody clothes Jane had left behind. A bathrobe belt, tied to the bedroom door, suggested that Thomas had been trapped in his own home. His glasses were neatly placed on the nightstand. It was as if someone had planned every detail of the crime. Where was Jane? The police soon found her car, and surveillance footage confirmed that she had been driving alone. Her phone, though, had gone silent. The tension mounted as the police realized they were hunting for her and trying to understand what had happened in that apartment. Jane had vanished, leaving behind only questions and clues that seemed to point directly at her. Her ID had been stolen, and her credit cards were used, leading investigators to follow her trail. But it wasn't until they found her car parked in a secluded spot in Cornwall that they caught up with her. For days after the murder, Jane was found slumped in the back seat of her car, barely alive after attempting to overdose on pills. Once again, Jane had survived, but now the truth was closing in on her. After her failed suicide attempt, Jane Andrews was rushed to the hospital and had her stomach pumped, saving her life once again. But when she woke up, her world had irrevocably shifted. The weight of the truth was closing in. Jane initially denied any involvement in Thomas Kresman's death. She claimed she didn't remember anything about stabbing him and suggested that he had been violent toward her. Her story was a desperate attempt to protect herself, but the evidence told a different story. The police had already pieced together the timeline of events. Jane had sent casual, distant texts to her friends asking about Thomas, as though she had no idea what had transpired. This, combined with the bloody clothes left behind and the bathrobe belt used to trap Thomas, told investigators that this wasn't a crime of passion. It was cold, calculated, and planned. The details didn't add up with Jane's story. Eventually, Jane confessed, though she was far from honest about the full extent of her actions. She claimed that Thomas had been abusive toward her, that she had hidden a knife under the bed for protection, and that when he became violent that night, she fought back. But her defense fell apart under scrutiny. The police had no evidence of any prior violence between them, and those who knew Thomas had nothing but praise for him, contradicting Jane's portrayal of him as a cruel, controlling man. In the courtroom, Jane's defense was shaky at best. She tried to paint herself as a woman who had been pushed to the edge by an abusive partner. But the jury wasn't convinced. The facts were clear. Jane had been obsessed with Thomas, had grown jealous and possessive, and when he rejected her, it pushed her into a state of desperation. The truth was far more chilling. After a grueling trial, lasting several weeks, the jury deliberated for nearly 12 hours. When they returned, their verdict was clear. Jane Andrews was guilty of murder. The judge sentenced Jane to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 12 years. Her actions had ended a life, shattered a family, and left an indelible scar on everyone involved. Thomas's family was devastated. His mother, who had tried calling him days before his body was discovered, was left heartbroken, and his friends struggled to understand how someone so full of promise could meet such a violent, senseless end. As Jane sat in her prison cell, the weight of her crime began to settle in. But she wasn't done. Even in prison, she couldn't escape her need for control. In 2010, she made an unexpected move. She escaped. It wasn't a bold escape, though. Jane was found just 6 miles away, at a hotel with her parents. Her escape wasn't punished severely, but it raised questions about her stability and willingness to remain within the confines of the law. Despite her escape, Jane's release on parole came in 2015 after she served 14 years of her sentence. The authorities decided that she was no longer a danger to society, but Jane's story was far from over. In 2018, she was arrested again, this time for harassing someone. She had not learned her lesson. After serving another year in jail, Jane was released in 2019, and this time, she was forced to start over in a quieter life. She moved to Lincolnshire and took a job stocking shelves at a grocery store. The woman who once lived in royal palaces, who had dined with the rich and powerful, now lived a life of obscurity. But even in this mundane existence, Jane carried the weight of her past. Her mental health struggles had never been fully addressed. In prison, she had been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, a condition that causes drastic mood swings, impulsive decisions, and unhealthy relationships. Some experts believe this diagnosis explains Jane's violent outbursts and inability to handle rejection. Yet, her disorder didn't change the facts of what she had done. At just 37 years old, Thomas Kresman's life was violently cut short. He had so many plans, so many dreams ahead of him, but those dreams were stolen in an instant by someone who couldn't accept the reality of rejection. His death was sudden, tragic, and senseless. For Jane, the road from Buckingham Palace to prison had been long and painful. From a young girl desperate to escape a life of poverty to a woman obsessed with wealth, power, and control, her story is one of shattered dreams and irreversible choices. Her life, once filled with the glamour of royalty, was now a quiet existence, far from the woman she had tried so hard to become. Jane Andrews, who had once been so close to the life of her dreams, would now live with the consequences of her actions for the rest of her life. As we reflect on Jane's story, it serves as a powerful reminder of how fragile love can be and how dangerous obsession can become when left unchecked. Thomas Kresman's life was taken in an instant, and the scars left behind will never fully heal. We must all remember how important it is to seek help when things feel out of control, to reach out before it's too late. Thank you for watching this true crime story. If this case gripped you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more real-life mysteries and chilling investigations. Crime Report 247 posts daily, bringing you fresh true crime stories and updates. Stay safe, stay alert, and we'll see you in the next one.